Well, and then you end the section actually with a list of 20 what you call different paradoxes. Do you have any in particular?
20, there's more.
There's more. In that list, though, do you have any in particular that you find the most challenging or forceful that you would adopt as the best ones to use from that list?
Obviously, I think if we're talking theism with a capital T, I think the problem of evil makes a brief appearance there. I think that one's hard. I actually really... It really bothers me, just not even just that an issue of philosophy or religion, but how I live my life is there seems to be a deep tension between justice and mercy. And I like both of those things.
Yeah.
But it bothers me that they're incompatible. So there's that one. And then just for classical theism, I think atemporal personhood is just nothing like what we mean by person. And I think it's right at the edge of incoherent on one side or the other. But more so, I just wanted to emphasize, the cumulative effect is what is really important. It's how this affects the probabilities when you have to address all of these if you want to be a theist, or I should say all of them if you want to be a classical theist. Obviously, Swinburne and crew is on a little better footing there. So
that's a good transition to the problem of evil then, since you mentioned that as one of the rather tougher issues to overcome for capital T theists. Maybe an initial question would be, a lot of people have argued that Plantinga killed the logical problem of evil. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's not quite true, or do you think he did sort of sufficiently address it and it's better to go with sort of an evidentialist approach, or do you think a logical one could be defended still?
I think two things. One, I think it is better to go with an evidential approach, but I also think that he didn't kill the logical problem.
Okay, yeah.
The book has to be of necessity summative, but I footnoted some of the problems, and I think the biggest problem just is, I feel like people who think the logical problem is dead due to Plantinga just haven't taught much ethics. Like, it just seems false as an ethical principle that in order for something to be morally significant, the choice must be between right and wrong, because clearly choices between right and neutral are morally significant choices. And so, like, one of the heaviest assumptions that it leans on, just I give it an incredulous stare. Like, well, wait a minute, why even think that tenet's true? And then, of course, there's some details that apply much more fully to the evidential problems, is that every time you're trying to explain evil in some way, you have to account for degree and you have to account for distribution. And I think just saying free will by itself doesn't do that, because it doesn't seem to cover, okay, well, maybe it's good that the soldier bayoneting the infant can express their free will in committing murder, but it seems to not cover the latter's free will. And so if free will is a good in that way, it seems like it has to be a good for everyone, not just some of the individuals.
Sure. Yeah. Even on the evidential side, I mean, we were really talking about a whole family of arguments here too, aren't we?
Yeah.
So we got I know there's Mackey and Smith, Schellenberg, Rose, Bruce Russell's. Sobel has a Bayesian version. Do you happen to find any of these in particular stronger than others, or are they all pretty?
Yeah, yes, I do. But it also, I think it kind of depends on what your goal is. If you're trying to convince yourself that you're an atheist, okay. Well, I don't need to do that. But I think in terms of just pure objective power, I think that what Draper calls the Humean version, where you're comparing alternatives and abductively rejecting the least possible. And I think that could also be interpreted as Bayesian as well, by the way. But I think that's just from a pure logic, assuming a neutral starting point, that one would be the most powerful.
Okay.
I think Rose, by kind of starting from these very specific examples rather than distribution and predictions, that's going to, if your goal is kind of convincing someone of the power of evil, the power of the problem of evil, I think that it's a more persuasive piece, but that's not because it has better logical chops. I mean, it has good logical chops, but just might work in certain ways better. So Mackey obviously defended the logical version, which I've seen a piece on, and presented his as human. So, but yeah, and I think the atheist naturalist here, well, just any atheist really, not just naturalist, it is just helped by just the appallingly unsatisfactory nature of theodicies. They're just
Sure.
like, the best ones aren't very even close to good.
Building off of that, then, how would you respond to some of the theists who would say that the problem of evil presupposes something like objective morality, and that one needs to be a moral realist in order to make the problem of evil? And again, I don't know if too many like high-end philosophers would never necessarily say that, but I know going back to some of these popular apologists like Frank Turek, they claim that you're basically stealing from God. You gotta accept basically their version of morality in order to even make this argument work. How do you respond to that, or how do you recommend an atheist respond to someone who's taking that line of reasoning?
So Turek definitely did that a lot in his book. I think, something I address a little later in my book. It's just, unless you're really doing some mental gyrations, it's just wildly false to claim that you need to be a theist to be moral, or to have an objective grounding in morality.
Right.
I have a pretty famous book by Aristotle, The Nicomachean Ethics, that was written by somebody who's an atheist for all intents and purposes. We have utilitarianism, we have deontology, we have lots of coherent, careful moral systems that do not require God in any sense. And so if you say, well, if you are an ethical realist, you're really a theist in disguise, I mean, it just seems like foot stamping. And it also seems to ignore a lot of biology too.
Do you think? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, because we know a lot of non-human things that act quote unquote morally, and there's experiments where monkeys recognize injustice for crying out loud. And I don't think there's any experience that show that monkeys can be theists.
Right.
But and it's just so contrary to reality. Having said all of that, it's important to really realize that all you really need for the problem of evil is if there's any sense in which you could say that someone is blameworthy for allowing more than a certain amount of suffering. And that's pretty morally neutral and independent of which meta-ethic you adopt.
I was going to say, do you think a person needs to even be a moral realist to run the problem of evil argument?
No, because ultimately the problem of evil is playing the theist game.
Right.
That, well, if the theist grants that theism would entail moral realism, the problem still goes full force, regardless of whether the person presenting the problem is a moral realist.
Right. It's more like a reductio sort of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think of, and maybe you can explain a little bit of your understanding of, and what critique you might give of skeptical theism's response to the problem of evil? How would you address their approach and sort of defense against it?
I guess my first claim is I feel like it's an approach out of necessity, because the theodicy is just, I will say a word or two so it doesn't seem like I'm dogmatic about this, but to talk about the problem of evil, you have to talk about degree. And it seems like the theodicies as presented just never talk sufficiently about degree. Why is this amount of freedom the perfect amount of freedom? Why is this amount of suffering the perfect amount to give us, courage and all these other soul-making properties? Why do we need this many people to die to appreciate life? It's just not there. And then, of course, you also have, these issues of justice and distribution. If this is a good that's worth it, then we should expect certain distribution patterns that just don't show up. And I feel like, if theists want to start really getting into theodicy, just get into those issues, present your findings. Tell me why the distributions of suffering between a perfectly just deity and no deity at all are identical, right? That's what you need to talk about. And until those conversations really happen in earnest, I don't see much persuasiveness in theodicy. Now, having said that, from that point, you might just say, wow, the problem of evil really is too hard. And there are theists who say that, by the way. Swinburne says that the existence of God basically says all of these considerations favor a deity, this one is against it, but the former outweigh the latter, which could really lead to a skeptical theism. So skeptical theism, to my understanding, the best version of it is going to say, well, there's a couple versions of it. One, you could say, if I have really good reason to believe there's a God, independently of the problem of evil, then being presented with the problem of evil might reduce my certainty, but still let me tentatively believe in the God of theism. If that's the case, then that entails that there are reasons for this suffering, even if I don't know them.
Mhm.
And so it's skeptical in that way.
Right.
That version presented as such, there's nothing intellectually wrong with it. But notice that requires you to give these very good reasons for believing not just in a higher power, but in a perfectly good God, independent of the problem of evil. And that's at least a Herculean, if not a Sisyphusian task, because ontological arguments don't seem to do it, and revelations are going to have problems we can talk about later.
Yeah.
Certainly not going to be strong enough evidence to overcome the problem of evil. The other version of skeptical theism is just we shouldn't expect to know God's reasons kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We should be skeptical of our own ability to understand these overriding reasons for God. I think that the latter, the biggest problem is, why are we doing religion in the first place? What I mean by that is we have worship worthiness to consider. That if a being is not worship worthy, then we don't really have any important things to do with religion. And the concern about a being who has reasons in morality that we can't understand, and that being doesn't really even give us any head nod of what they might be, is this undercutting of worship worthiness. And now some theistic listeners might say, so what? But remember, one of the definitions of theism in the capital T sense is maximal worship worthiness. So if a God could have done better, say by making reasons for suffering more clear, there's still a significant problem there.